Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we take a monumental figure from American history, crack open the archives, and really give you a thorough, detailed understanding of their true journey.
And today we are undertaking a deep dive into an activist whose life was a physical and spiritual bridge, a bridge between the brutality of Northern slavery and the promise of civil rights.
We're talking about Sojourner Truth.
Exactly. But our mission today is, well, it's ambitious. Because the figure the world thinks it knows, Sojourner Truth, the author of Ain't I a Woman, is largely a historical distortion.
Right.
We're going back to the beginning, to Isabella Bomefree, tracing her path from an enslaved child in New York to this pivotal national figure who championed, everything. Abolition, women's rights, temperance.
Okay, let's unpack this immediately, because her biography, right off the bat, it just dismantles this standard mental image most people have of a 19th century formerly enslaved person and activist.
It absolutely does.
We have two just astonishing facts that radically reshape her origin story.
Absolutely. When most people envision 19th century slavery in the U.S., they're thinking of the Deep South, right? Cotton plantations, spirituals.
Of course.
But Isabella Bomefree was born into slavery in New York State around 1797, specifically in the Hudson Valley, which is an area with a long, profitable history of chattel slavery that, it often gets overlooked.
This was the North, but it was far from free.
Far from it. And the geography is crucial, but the linguistic reality is maybe even more startling.
Her first language wasn't English.
It was Dutch.
Dutch. It's just wild to think about.
That's correct. She was born on the Colonel Hardenberg estate in Swartkill, and she was raised speaking the Low Dutch that was common among the landowners and, well, the local populace in that part of New York.
The sources are clear on this.
Oh, definitive.
Right.
She spoke with a pronounced Dutch accent for the rest of her life. And this detail, it's not just biographical trivia, it's fundamental to understanding the whole controversy around her most famous speech, which we'll get into later. It means the iconic voice we think we hear is fundamentally wrong.
That reality, the language, coupled with her birth in New York, it instantly forces you to recognize how unique she was. She just defied all the expectations placed on enslaved people at the time.
Exactly. And her biographer, Nell Irvin Painter, she summed up this intersectional struggle just perfectly, and it's really our guiding mission for this deep dive. She said, "At a time when most Americans thought of slaves as male and women as white, Truth embodied a fact that still bears repeating. Among the blacks are women. Among the women, there are blacks."
Wow.
She was literally fighting on multiple fronts before we even had the words for it, like intersectionality.
And before we dive into her brutal early life, we have to preview this one fact. It just demonstrates her relentless tenacity and this profound belief in justice.
Yes.
In 1828, Isabella Bomefree became the first black woman to successfully sue a white man in a U.S. court and win the case.
And win. This is before she Sojourner Truth. This proves she was an extraordinary legal and political combatant from the absolute beginning.
So let's anchor ourselves there, in her beginnings. Let's focus first on the geography and the reality of what slavery looked like in New York State.
Right. So Isabella was born around 1797 to James and Elizabeth Bomefree. Her father was captured in what is now Ghana, and her mother was from the area of Guinea. They were owned by Colonel Johannes Hardenberg.
And the North system of slavery, it was different from the South's, but that doesn't mean it was better.
Not at all. It was no less devastating. New York City, for example, had one of the largest enslaved populations north of the Mason-Dixon line. It was focused more on, say, agricultural work in the Hudson Valley and domestic service in the city.
And for her, the trauma of family separation, that started almost immediately.
It did. She was one of maybe 10 or 12 children, and when she was still an infant, her 5-year-old brother and 3-year-old sister were sold away.
That's just a foundational trauma.
Absolutely. Her mother, Elizabeth, tried to provide some kind of solace by teaching her children to pray, telling them that God was in the sky, watching over them, and that they had to always try to be good. These spiritual lessons were, perhaps the only enduring positive influence of her entire childhood.
Then at age 9, in 1806, the violence of the marketplace takes hold. Could you walk us through that rapid succession of sales that really characterized her youth?
It's a rapid, terrifying sequence of transactions that just highlights her powerlessness. At 9, she sold at an auction with a flock of sheep.
With sheep?
For $100 to a man named John Neely near Kingston. And you have to imagine the immediate psychological shock. She's suddenly owned by a man whose language, English, she can't understand at all.
So her first English-speaking owner was also her first violently cruel owner.
That's right. She later recounted how Neely beat her daily, just using whatever was at hand, including a bundle of rods. She was physically isolated by language and abused because she just couldn't follow instructions given in English.
So this inability to communicate just exposed her to the worst forms of violence.
Immediately. And that sale, it only lasted about 18 months, which just speaks to the instability and, frankly, the disposable nature of her status.
And then the sales just continued.
They did. Neely sold her to Martina Shriver for $105, and then Shriver sold her to John Dumont in West Park, New York in 1810.
And it was under Dumont that her life was marked by this immense, enduring personal trauma.
Yes. John Dumont owned her for 18 years. It was the longest period she spent with any single enslaver, and those years were just horrific. There was constant friction with Dumont's wife, Elizabeth, who was very jealous and critical of Isabella's work. But the deepest scars, they were the forbidden love and the sexual violence.
Let's discuss the story of Robert, because it really reviews the absolute destructive power of the property system.
So Isabella fell deeply in love with a man named Robert, who was enslaved on a neighboring farm. Now, crucially, Robert's owner did not want Robert to father children with someone he didn't own.
Because that would be creating property for another man.
Exactly. So when Robert snuck over to see Isabella, his owner and his son caught him and just brutally beat him. Isabella watched this savage attack, and she never saw Robert again.
My God.
He died a few years later. She said this loss and the trauma from it haunted her entire life. It's just a perfect illustration of how slavery targeted the most fundamental human right to love and build a family.
And compounding that heartbreak was the horrific reality of repeated rape by her owner, John Dumont.
Yes, the sources are very clear on this trauma. Her daughter Diana, who was born in 1815, was the result of that violence. She did later marry an enslaved man named Thomas, and with him she had 3 other children who survived: Peter, Elizabeth, and Sophia. But her body was never her own. Her family structure was defined by the economic and violent demands of the slave system.
Now, the path to legal freedom in New York wasn't a clean break. It was a phased, sort of confusing process. How did New York's gradual emancipation framework lead up to her decision to finally leave?
So New York passed this gradual abolition law in 1799, but it was really designed to protect the economic interests of slaveholders. It stipulated that all enslaved people would finally be freed on July 4th, 1827.
Okay.
Now, Dumont had promised Isabella freedom a year early as a reward for her service, but only if she produced 100 pounds of wool for him. She did the work, but then she sustained a hand injury.
And he used that as an excuse.
He reneged. He claimed the injury made her service incomplete and just kept her enslaved longer.
So she had fulfilled her end of the bargain, but the promise was broken. What was the exact moment and, I guess, the philosophy of her escape in 1826?
Late in 1826, she made a moral decision. She walked away. She didn't view herself as a criminal or a fugitive, which is so crucial to her later self-image. She took her infant daughter, Sophia, and later explained her dignified act, saying, "I did not run off, but I walked off," believing that to be all right.
She claimed her moral freedom, but the law still entangled her. She had to leave her older children behind. Why was that?
Under those gradual emancipation laws, children born enslaved after 1799 were technically freed, but they were required to serve as bound servants. It was a form of indentured servitude until their late 20s.
So her older children were still legally bound to Dumont.
Exactly, which meant she literally had to abandon them to save herself and her infant daughter.
That choice must have been just excruciating. But it immediately fueled her next move of fight to reclaim what was stolen from her.
It did. She found refuge with Isaac and Maria Van Wagenen, who were a Quaker family and sympathetic to the abolitionist cause. They offered to pay Dumont $20 for her services for the remaining year until full emancipation, just to ensure her safe passage. And it was under their protection that she learned a really devastating piece of news.
Which was the illegal sale of her 5-year-old son, Peter.
Yes. Dumont had illegally sold Peter, who was not yet legally free under New York law, out of state, first to a buyer in New York, and then eventually Peter was resold to a man named Solomon Gedney in Alabama.
And selling an enslaved person out of state before that 1827 deadline, that was a violation of New York's law.
A direct violation. And for a black woman in 1828 to successfully challenge a white man in the New York Supreme Court, I mean, how radical was that victory? What specific legal framework even allowed her to bring the case?
It seems almost impossible.
It was almost unprecedented. We have to understand, the justice system was fundamentally designed to protect white property rights, not the rights of a formerly enslaved black mother. What allowed her to proceed was the assistance of the Van Wagenen family. They lent their name and legal advice, and the specific violation of that 1817 New York law about selling minors out of state.
So it wasn't a general fight for abolition, it was a specific technical challenge to an illegal act.
Precisely. She was relying on the law, flawed as it was, to protect a child who was legally a ward of the state until 1827. So using the name Isabella Van Wagenen, she filed suit.
And it must have been a long, difficult process.
The case was protracted and required just immense courage on her part. She faced down Solomon Gedney, a powerful white man, in court. But in 1828, she won. The court ruled in her favor, and Peter was recovered and returned to New York.
But not without scars, I'd imagine.
No. Sources note he arrived traumatized and physically abused from his time in Alabama.
That victory, though, the recovery of her son, it's just monumental. It underscores this tenacious core of her character and her early mastery of navigating a hostile system.
It's critical. And the rediscovery and analysis of those court documents, especially around 2022, they only solidify her status as one of the very first African-American women to successfully use the white legal system against a white man. It confirms that the fight for justice was, like, literally in her DNA decades before she became a national celebrity.
Right. That tenacity carried Isabella through the 1830s in New York City, where she's searching for spiritual guidance, for community. She even briefly got involved in some controversial religious groups like the Prophet Matthias sect, but all of that culminated in this dramatic, prophetic transformation in 1843.
The change was sudden and it was absolute. On Pentecost Sunday, June 1st, 1843, Isabella Bomefree changed her name to Sojourner Truth.
Sojourner Truth.
She felt she had received a divine commandment to travel, to leave the city, and go into the countryside, testifying to the hope that was in her.
And the name itself, it speaks volumes about her new identity, doesn't it?
It does. Sojourner means a temporary resident, a traveler, which reflected her new life as an itinerant preacher, just constantly moving and testifying. And Truth reflected the message she felt called to deliver about God and humanity.
So she just left.
She literally took almost nothing, just a small bundle of clothing and a pillowcase, and began walking, heading north and east toward Massachusetts. She was no longer a formerly enslaved domestic worker. She was a public intellectual and a prophet.
And as she began her ministry, what religious communities was she engaging with? How did she find her public voice?
Initially, she fell in with the Millerite Adventist camp meetings. The Millerites followed the teachings of William Miller, who had predicted the second coming of Christ would happen in 1843 and 1844. Oh, right.
And her powerful speaking, combined with her beautiful, deep voice and powerful singing, it drew huge crowds within these meetings.
But when that prophecy failed, the Great Disappointment as it's known, she maintained her faith, but she distanced herself from the core Millerite movement.
Exactly. She kept her deep spirituality, but moved away from specific failed predictions. And this search for community and purpose led her in 1844 to a really crucial intellectual hub, the Northampton Association of Education and Industry in Florence, Massachusetts.
This was a utopian community. Can you give us a sense of what the Northampton Association stood for?
It was remarkable for its time. It was founded by staunch abolitionists, and it was a communitarian experiment built on principles of equality. It promoted women's rights, religious tolerance, and absolute pacifism.
So they tried to create this self-sustaining environment where everyone, black and white, men and women, shared labor and shared education.
That was the goal. And it was the perfect intellectual furnace for Sojourner Truth. It was her launch pad.
What did she do there? She worked, she oversaw the laundry, but most importantly, she met and engaged with some of the greatest minds of the abolitionist movement who were either members or frequent visitors. She met William Lloyd Garrison, the editor of The Liberator.
Of course.
Frederick Douglass, the great orator. David Ruggles. It was while living in this radically abolitionist, pro-women's rights environment that she delivered her first formal anti-slavery speeches.
Now, since she was illiterate, she couldn't read or write, how did the story of Isabella Bomefree, the northern slave, reach the broader public?
Her lack of literacy never hindered her ability to communicate her story. While she was living in Florence, she dictated her life story to her friend, Olive Gilbert. And this resulted in the publication of The Narrative of Sojourner Truth, a northern slave in 1850.
And the fact that William Lloyd Garrison himself privately published it, that speaks volumes about how influential her story was becoming in those circles.
Absolutely. The memoir, along with her reputation as a preacher, it established her fame. But she also had this a really revolutionary entrepreneurial strategy for funding her relentless activism.
Right, she was a masterful self-promoter.
She really understood the nascent power of media and branding. At that time, photography was a novelty, and these mass-produced small photos called carte de visite were becoming popular. They were basically collectible calling cards.
And she sold these to support her work.
She sold these portraits to support her travels and her speaking engagements.
And the caption on those cards is one of the most memorable quotes of her life. "I sell the shadow to support the substance." What does that tell us about her view of her own public image?
It's a genius statement. It demonstrates her self-awareness and, frankly, her entrepreneurial sophistication. The shadow is the image, right? The public spectacle, the photo she sells. The substance is the actual tangible work of abolition, temperance, women's rights, the work that the money funds.
So she understood her image had currency.
And she used that currency to fund her true spiritual and political mission. She was monetizing her celebrity to ensure her independence.
That move really solidified her ability to remain an independent voice, and it set the stage for her full engagement in the women's rights movement. In 1850, the same year her narrative was published, she delivered a speech at the first National Women's Rights Convention in Worcester, Massachusetts, and that just fully launched her onto the national platform. Okay, so now we arrive at the pivotal moment, the one that defines her legacy, yet is just shrouded in historical conflict. We're talking about the extemporaneous address she gave at the Ohio Women's Rights Convention in Akron in May of 1851.
Yes, the speech that would later become known as Ain't I a Woman?
And this is maybe the most crucial segment of our deep dive, because it illustrates how historical figures, especially Black women, have had their voices filtered, edited, and even, fictionalized by white allies to fit a specific narrative.
It's a perfect case study. Truth delivered the speech, combining the fight for abolition with the demand for women's rights, and she powerfully drew on her strength as a lifelong laborer.
So we have to analyze the two profoundly different versions of this speech, because they tell two distinct stories about Sojourner Truth and American history. Let's start with version A, which is what we accept as the closest contemporary account.
Right. Version A was recorded and published just a month after the event by Reverend Marius Robinson, who was the editor of the Anti-Slavery Bugle. He was in the audience. And this version is what historians widely accept as the most accurate representation of the content and the delivery.
So what were the main arguments she deployed, according to that 1851 account?
Okay, so first, she focused on physical equality and capability. She directly challenged this idea of female fragility by stating her own experience. She said, "I have as much muscle as any man and can do as much work as any man. I have plowed and reaped and husked and chopped and mowed, and can any man do more than that?"
She's staking her claim to rights based on her undeniable capacity for labor.
Exactly. The second argument was intellectual, the famous pint and quart analogy.
Right.
She addressed the condescending arguments that women were intellectually inferior. She challenged the men by saying, "As for intellect, all I can say is, if a woman have a pint and a man a quart, why can't she have her little pint full?"
It's such a beautifully concise, logical argument.
It is. She goes on, "You need not be afraid to give us our rights, for fear we will take too much, for we can't take more than our pint will hold." It's just a perfect argument for full potentiality.
And third, she used powerful theological arguments to counter the male clergy who were using the Bible to keep women subservient.
Oh, she masterfully turned their scripture right back against them. She referred to Eve and the role of women in sin, and then she pivoted to the birth of Jesus, she asked. And how came Jesus into the world? Through God who created him and the woman who bore him? Man, where was your part?
I mean, that rhetorical mastery just quieted the religious opposition.
Completely. Now here is the factual core that contradicts the legend, the 1851 Robinson version. It did not include the repeating question, "Ain't I a woman?"
That's the pivotal historical truth.
Right. Robinson's account confirms that her delivery was that of an articulate, powerful, Dutch-accented orator from New York. And furthermore, contemporary reports suggest the atmosphere at the convention was largely respectful and supportive, which contradicts later claims that she was facing widespread hostility.
So where did the legend come from? Let's turn to version B, the popularized account.
Version B was published 12 years later, in 1863, by Frances Dana Barker Gage, who had chaired the convention. This version became the standard text because it was published during the Civil War, and it's circulated widely in newspapers and magazines that were looking for these poignant narratives of Northern abolitionism.
So what was the most significant editorial choice Gage made in her 1863 version?
Gage completely rewrote the speech in a heavy, stereotypical Southern black dialect. She used phrases like, "dis child" and "where was your part." She applied a linguistic filter that Sojourner Truth, the Dutch-speaking New Yorker, never possessed.
And this was the mechanism by which it became the rhythmic repeated question, "Ain't I a woman?"
Exactly. Gage included that question 4 times.
This editorial choice is so crucial. Why did Gage feel the need to apply this Southern dialect to a Northern woman?
Well, historical analysis suggests that Gage was, either consciously or subconsciously, making truth a more effective, more recognizable symbol for the Civil War era. The narrative power of the oppressed, dialect-speaking slave from the South was at its absolute height.
So she was shaping truth into a more useful icon for the cause.
It seems so. By stylizing Truth's voice and exaggerating her suffering, Gage claimed Truth had 13 children sold away when the record shows 5, with only 1 sold and later recovered. Gage amplified the emotional resonance for a white audience, but at the same time, she completely obscured Truth's actual background as this sophisticated Northern litigant and preacher.
So the version that gave the speech its iconic title and rhythm also completely erased her authentic voice and experience.
Exactly. It raises a fascinating question about mediation. Did Gage help elevate the message of the speech at the expense of the truth of the speaker? Scholar Angela Davis pointed out that this incident highlights how even well-meaning white allies struggled to grant black women full autonomy over their own representation.
They wanted the symbol more than the reality.
They wanted the symbol of the suffering Southern slave more than the reality of the articulate Northern activist.
It's just a profound thought that the most recognizable version of her voice is, in fact, a fictionalization. It's rooted not in her Dutch New York accent, but in a racial stereotype. This makes the true content, the analysis of labor, intellect, and theology in Robinson's 1851 text, even more powerful, because that represents her authentic intellectual contribution.
And following that Akron speech, Sojourner Truth continued her relentless campaign for another 3 decades, just demonstrating incredible resilience all across the country. From 1851 to 1861, she was constantly on the road, often traveling with Reverend Marius Robinson, selling her narrative and her carte de visite.
And she didn't shy away from confrontation. It seems like she almost thrived on turning hostile audiences around.
Her response to hostility was legendary. In 1853, she spoke at a suffragist mob convention in New York City. The crowd was incredibly hostile, greeting her with hissing and groaning.
And what did she do?
She famously stood firm and just used their energy against them, saying, "You may hiss as much as you please, but women will get their rights anyway. You can't stop us, neither." Her confidence was just unshakable.
And she had a secondary weapon in her arsenal, distinct from her powerful spoken sermons: her music.
Music was integral to her identity as an itinerant preacher. She often used it to calm a crowd or to center herself before a speech. In Boston in the 1840s, she was nervous about following the great orator Wendell Phillips.
That's understandable.
So to quiet the hall, she sang one of her own compositions, "I Am Pleading for My People," which was set to the tune of Auld Lang Syne. And it worked immediately. It shifted the emotional register of the room and allowed her to transition into her message. She was a performer, a preacher, and a political activist all in one person.
Her life eventually led her to Michigan, which became her home base as the country descended into the Civil War.
Right. She settled in Battle Creek, Michigan around 1857, joining a community of abolitionists there. And when the Civil War broke out, she immediately committed her energy to the Union cause. She actively helped recruit black men into the Union Army, emphasizing that this was a fight for their people's future.
And this was a deeply personal effort for her.
Very personal. Her grandson, James Caldwell, enlisted in the famous 54th Massachusetts Regiment. She even wrote a patriotic song, "The Valiant Soldiers," for the 1st Michigan Colored Regiment.
And her dedication to the Union cause was recognized at the highest level. She had a meeting with President Lincoln.
That's right. In October of 1864, while she was working for the National Freedmen's Relief Association in Washington, D.C., she was invited to and met with President Abraham Lincoln in the White House. She presented him with her book, and he signed her autograph album.
That meeting, it just visually symbolizes the immense distance she traveled. From being chattel property in New York to advising the President of the United States on Reconstruction policy.
It's incredible. And following the war, her activism shifted from grand speeches to specific, tangible, local action, specifically targeting racial segregation.
Tell us about that.
Yes, 1865 in D.C. was a critical moment for direct action. While she was working at the Freedmen's Hospital, she began riding streetcars. Now, Washington's streetcars were segregated, but she, along with other activists, would just ride them and force the issue. If she was denied entry or thrown off, she would immediately protest and demand the conductor's name.
So she was one of the key figures using direct civil disobedience to force the desegregation of D.C.'s public transportation system.
A full century before the Civil Rights Movement formalized those same tactics.
Then we see her turn her focus to the economic future of the newly freed population, tackling that famous promise of 40 acres and a mule. This was the land campaign.
This campaign really demonstrates her forward-thinking understanding that political freedom without economic power is, well, it's incomplete. Starting around 1870, she campaigned tirelessly for 7 years, arguing that formerly enslaved people should be granted federal land out west, public domain lands, where they could build self-sufficient homes and farms and escape reliance on government aid or their former enslavers.
Did she have specific arguments she pressed when she was meeting with political figures like President Grant?
Oh, she was very pragmatic. She told President Grant that freed people needed land to become fully productive, tax-paying citizens. She argued that they knew how to work and that giving them land would benefit the entire country by creating a self-reliant population rather than a dependent one. Her philosophy was all about ensuring dignity and self-determination through property ownership.
But that campaign, despite her meeting with Grant, was ultimately unsuccessful. What historical factors led to the failure to secure land grants?
The failure was just devastating, and it really set the course for Black poverty for generations. The campaign failed primarily due to political resistance, Northern fatigue with Reconstruction, and the immense power of Southern landholders who resisted any proposal that would transfer wealth or dilute their labor force.
So the promise of 40 acres and a mule was never really legislated on a national scale.
Never. Which meant formerly enslaved people were left without the capital or the land necessary to transition from bondage to genuine economic freedom. It remains one of the great lost opportunities of American history.
And throughout this entire period, she was simultaneously battling for universal suffrage.
Right up until the very end. Her suffrage work culminated in 1872 when she was active in Ulysses S. Grant's re-election campaign. She actually attempted to vote in Battle Creek but was turned away.
Which just illustrates the hypocrisy of a system that lauded her service but denied her the rights of citizenship.
Exactly, and she pressed the urgency of the moment during her 1867 speech to the American Equal Rights Association.
What was her central argument there regarding the timing of Black women's rights?
She argued that since the 15th Amendment was poised to grant Black men the right to vote, now was the absolute, non-negotiable best time to secure rights for Black women. She used a memorable analogy, saying that if the nation was fixing the carriage of state referring to Reconstruction, you shouldn't stop halfway.
And she backed this up with that same labor argument we first heard in Akron.
She did. She explicitly connected economic contribution to political right. She argued that women, especially Black women, paid taxes because they owned property and therefore they should vote. And then she added that enslaved women were made to do the hardest manual labor, like building roads, which only reinforced her simple logic.
If they're strong enough to work the land and build the roads, they're certainly qualified to cast a ballot.
That was her point. She stressed that we should keep things going while things are stirring, because she feared that once that window of opportunity closed, it would take decades to reopen the fight for Black women.
And Sojourner Truth's extraordinary life of advocacy and travel, it finally concluded in Battle Creek, Michigan.
Yes. She died on November 26, 1883. She was an impressive 86 years old, cared for by her daughters. Her funeral was a major public event, attended by nearly 1,000 people. It really marked the end of an era.
And her friend and longtime colleague, Frederick Douglass, he offered a powerful eulogy.
He did. He recognized her unique contribution. He praised her as venerable for age, distinguished for insight into human nature, remarkable for independence and courageous self-assertion, devoted to the welfare of her race. She was, in the truest sense, a national treasure by the time of her death.
Her legacy really is the embodiment of intersectional justice. I mean, she was bridging the racial and gender divides decades before modern movements even crystallized those ideas.
And the recognition she has received since then, it reflects the scale of her impact. She holds a unique position in the U.S. Capitol building. She is the first African-American woman to have a statue there. It's a bust, sculpted by artist Lane, unveiled in Emancipation Hall in 2009.
And the monuments and honors, they span the country and beyond. There's a 12-foot bronze statue in Battle Creek. The M66 highway is now the Sojourner Truth Memorial Highway. New York has recognized her origins with the Sojourner Truth State Park near her birthplace.
And, one of the most visible recent acknowledgments came in 2020 with the installation of the Women's Rights Pioneers Monument in Central Park.
Right, depicting Truth alongside Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. But that statue also serves as a potent reminder of the historical struggle for inclusion.
It really does.
Because the initial plans excluded women of color entirely, correct?
That's right. The original proposal only included Stanton and Anthony. It was only after significant public objection and criticism about the historical erasure of contributions by women of color that Sojourner Truth was added to the design.
So her physical presence in one of the world's most famous parks, it solidifies her recognition. But the controversy around her inclusion just highlights that the very intersectional justice she fought for remains an ongoing battle today.
It does, and her influence has literally spanned into the cosmos. The NASA Mars Pathfinder robotic rover, launched in 1997, was named Sojourner.
That's incredible.
And the U.S. Navy named a fleet replenishment oiler, a crucial logistics and support vessel, the USNS Sojourner Truth.
She has become a national benchmark. The Smithsonian recognized her as one of the 100 most significant Americans of all time in 2014, and she is slated to appear on the back of the newly designed $10 bill.
Right, cementing her place among the pioneers of suffrage and civil rights.
And finally, we have to note her enduring influence on modern scholarship.
Absolutely. Her struggle for self-definition and recognition directly inspired the title of Bell Hook's influential first major work of feminist theory, Ain't I a Woman?, which interrogated the position of Black women in feminist and political movements. And she's honored with a place setting in Judy Chicago's renowned art installation, The Dinner Party, which marks her contribution to female achievement across history.
So to sum up this deep dive, we've traced the journey of Isabella Bomefree, a New York Dutch-speaking slave, through her groundbreaking legal victory in 1828, her spiritual renaming to Sojourner Truth, and her tireless decades-long advocacy for the broad interests of all humanity, covering abolition, women's rights, desegregation, and economic justice.
And we've seen her mastery of rhetoric, her strategic use of song and public image, and her unrelenting focus on securing both racial and gender equality, often at great personal risk. But most importantly, we have, I think, forensically analyzed the central conflict of her public life, recognizing that the powerful legend of the Ain't I a Woman speech came at the direct expense of the verifiable, eloquent, Dutch accented voice that was recorded in 1851.
And that brings us to our final provocative thought for you to chew on as you reflect on her incredible life. Given that the most quoted, the most celebrated version of Sojourner Truth's voice was edited and stylized by a well-meaning white editor, Frances Dana Barker Gage, to fit an expectation of what an enslaved person should sound like. What does that mean for our understanding of other historical figures?
Right.
When we study history, and particularly when we hear historical voices filtered through contemporary media or political necessity or the pen of an intermediary, what other vital voices might we think we know, but are actually hearing through a powerful lens of expectation, rather than their own authentic truth?
And what is the cost to history and to the legacy of those who fought for the truth when the legend becomes more prominent than the verifiable facts?
That's a powerful point. We hope we've given you a fuller, richer, and more accurate understanding of the incredible life and multifaceted legacy of Sojourner Truth, the Dutch-speaking New Yorker who walked off to claim her freedom. We'll see you next time.